Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your visit. Thank you for the work you're doing here. To Aspen, to Dominica, and to all of you present who are doing important work in the 6 cities that have been chosen, and others of you doing it generically in this field for our country. Some real models are going to be created out of the kind of thought that is occurring here. We have 2 really qualified people to talk about access to capital for small business, and particularly minority small business. I will introduce them at this point, beginning with Mark Madrid. Mark, if you would come forward and take your seat on the stage. Associate Administrator of the Office of Entrepreneurial Development in the U.S. Small Business Administration, which is the office that oversees technical assistance to groups like the Small Business Development Centers across the country, the Women's Business Centers across the country, SCORE, and others. He previously was CEO of the Latino Business Action Network, based at Stanford, and in that capacity was named the 2019 Silicon Valley Nonprofit CEO of the Year. Has many other honors. He was previously on Wall Street, beginning in 1995 at JP Morgan, but his real association with entrepreneurship began in his family. His father owned a wedding business for over 4 decades, and it's in his genes to work on small business. It's a special pleasure for me to introduce him because he's a graduate of the University of Texas and Notre Dame. The next person I'll introduce is Bruce Katz, who I have the great privilege of having worked with Bruce when I was Secretary of Housing. He's the co-founder and inaugural director of what's called the Drexel University Nowak Metropolitan Finance Lab. But simply stated, Bruce is arguably one of a handful, and I use those words advisedly, a handful of people on the globe who fully understand the importance of localities, metropolitan economies, and the workings, the dynamics of metropolitan economies. When one becomes a secretary in a cabinet department, you name about 14 people to key positions, assistant secretary level positions. And they give you a notebook on each of those positions that's full of names of people who want to do them, or people who are qualified to do them, or people who are available. Almost every one of the 14 notebooks that I got when I became secretary included the name Bruce Katz for every job in the department. When I met with Bruce to offer him whatever he wanted, he said he wanted to be chief of staff of the department, which meant he would be the real secretary of the department. So we worked together very closely for the next 4 years, and most of the good ideas, more importantly, most of the effective efforts that came out of HUD in those days emanated with Bruce, a very fertile brain and a wonderful mind for the way the federal government works. So I owe him a debt of gratitude for life. He left HUD to go to the Brookings Institution, where created the now famous Metropolitan Center, which is a real think tank on metropolitan issues. And then in various capacities have been working around the world, including writing the book on New Localism a few years ago, and now working at Drexel, but reaching out to people literally in every city across the country and abroad. Bruce Katz. So these 2 people. Frequently when one mentions access to capital, it becomes sort of just words. Because every diagnosis of problems among minority business will always mention access to capital. I've probably been in 100 sessions on access to capital, but nobody ever seems to do very much about it. There's a lot of diagnoses, a lot of talk. I would like to tease out from these folks in the next half hour, and then in the 15 minutes that follows that, get your questions. Tease out the real underpinnings of the access to capital problem, but more importantly, the opportunities to do something about it. What are concrete things we can do? What are best practices now at work somewhere in the country that can be replicated more broadly? So I'd like to sort of divide the conversation into three pieces. The first, what are the real dimensions of the problem? Let's peel back the layer of the onion and tell us, at the core of it, what is the access to capital problem? Secondly, why is it a problem? In other words, what is it about the ecosystem of capital providers, what's in their heads that make it so hard to solve this? And thirdly, what do we see across the country that's possible? So let me begin, Mark, with you. What is your quick assessment? And by the way, I reserve the right to intervene and
Absolutely.
to interrupt if the conversation doesn't get to the meat of the question soon enough. And because we're going to try to move fast here. Mark, what is the problem?
Mr. Secretary, honored to be with you. The problem, and we saw it firsthand in the pandemic. Let's get to the bottom line. Latinos were approved at half the rate of white-owned businesses in terms of the first draw of PPP. And so that was an issue. First of all, hello familia. Some in this room were part of the decisioning table at the outbreak of the pandemic when I was at the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative in LBAN, and we thought something bad is about to happen. What are we going to do about it? So we actually projected forward on servicing scaled Latinx entrepreneurs that come through the Stanford program, which is about 800 at the time. So we have to mobilize this group because we feel like access is going to be a problem. That it's
access to the PPPs.
Access to capital overall has been a problem, but to PPP specifically, okay. Here was
you're saying that was a sort of a case study of the problem.
That's right. We projected a real-time case study.
Right.
And so what ensued was, one, we had to mobilize this cluster and think that they have the capability, we provide the resources real time to be able to go beyond what we expect to happen in terms of access to financial resources. So this particular cluster, through mobilization efforts, through them being peer-to-peer mentors to their own selves, ended up in an 82% securitization of PPP funding, first draw, which was by far the highest percentage of access of any small business cluster in the country that we know of. Okay. And so what that taught us is that there's an appetite from this community to do something about the barrier.
Provided that certain conditions occur. What's the underlying dimension? Outreach on the part of the financial institution? What was different?
I believe it's knowing thy audience, knowing and empathizing with them, truly understanding. We always said, have elephant ears and not hippo ears. In other words, we have to hear you, meet you where you are, understand your needs. A 45-minute webinar sometimes is not applicable to small business owners that are trying to run their companies. Also, we had to have specialists. So we had a CDFI on site with us and the alumni webinars that could answer any questions right there on the spot. There was a trail of emails that followed in a mobile alumni app. And so the entrepreneurs, they knew where to go, directional. They knew they could have specialized answers to their issues and questions. And anytime there's an update from the SBA, we had a on-time, real-time webinar.
Absent that kind of effort, it was a special case. You had a special effort to reach them. What is the guts of the problem? People are not reaching out. They don't know. They're too busy with other things that are right on their plate. They can't get to the next financial question. They don't understand the finance. What is it?
Yeah, the concept of, build a relationship with your banker before you need the money, that hasn't been happening on both sides. And so it's an outreach problem. It's an understanding of the financial bankable market, understanding what's available prior to that, like CDFIs and CDCs. So that's all part of the issue.
And it's clearly a limiting factor. When the Aspen folks do an analysis that tells us the vast majority of Latino businesses are either one employee by himself, one person by himself, or 2 or 3 employees, like 85% or something. Is this the problem?
Yes, it's an educational problem.
I mean, access to capital is the core of it?
It's a core root of the issue, but it's more multi-dimensional. It's also access to people and networks.
Okay, Bruce?
Yeah, I tend to think in tweets these days. So here's the tweet.
We're treated to 140 digits.
Okay, I think this will fit. And first of all, Dominica, thanks for inviting me. Capital's not the problem. Organizing capital is the problem. We are awash in capital in the United States right now, both on the public side and on the private side. So why do we have this, what I would think of as almost a last mile problem? Partly data. We all say we love small business, but the data we have about small business is usually 3, 4, 5 years old. So we don't have any current information, not just about firms, their size, but their sector. And it's the sector bit, I think, that really affects the form of capital. Second, I think this is more a cultural thing for the United States. We tend to think about individual entrepreneurs rather than collective ecosystems. And it's that ecosystem that provides demand for business, supplier diversity, the contracts, but also the coaching. When you look at venture capital in the US, they don't just give out equity, they actually coach the firms.
Right.
When we deal with small business or entrepreneurs, we say, go over here to get the coaching, go over there to get the capital, never the twain shall meet. Okay. So that's an ecosystem problem. And then I think we have sort of a paradigmatic problem, which is that innovation in the US means tech, means unicorns, means scale, right? And there's an enormous amount of innovation in the US, usually tech-driven, tech-enabled, but it doesn't fit sort of a Silicon Valley definition of innovation. And so there's an innovation blind spot, essentially. And so firms that fit the Silicon Valley definition, usually R&D, commercialization, able to scale globally, they're treated one way. Everyone else is treated, again, to the side.
Okay. So Bruce, let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem of capital providers as it exists today. What would you say are the major inadequacies in the system as it exists today to reach the small minority enterprise that has a chance to grow?
I would say the principal barrier is there's no focus on demand. Capital usually follows demand in some respects. So when we're thinking about by sector, what is the demand for that business? If you're in a local retail, you're looking at purchasing power. If you're in the real estate business, you may be focusing on housing or you may be focusing on public infrastructure. And then just across other sectors. So what's the demand for your business? And who is helping to coach you on that demand and getting you the contracts that ultimately enable you to get the kind of quality capital to start, to grow, to scale? So we have a system, and again, I think this is a peculiar American thing, where we focus on the money, right? The capital, the financial product. We're like financially obsessed, the financialization of our entire economy. And we don't really focus on the demand side or the particular kinds of businesses which tend to sort of align with their different sectors. So what does it mean to go into a public infrastructure business? Whether it's road reconstruction, whether it's around electricity, whether it's around transit. I mean, let's literally parse this. So we're spending too much on one side of the continuum and literally nothing on the other side of the continuum.
The data problem that you described
The
as part
data
of that?
problem and this demand side. I mean, how many people know who the procurement officer is at the Port Authority, at the Airport Authority, at the Department of Transportation, at the Public Housing Agency? I mean, just go down the list, authority after authority after authority. Who are the procurement officers? Try to find them. I mean,
So Bruce, if you're talking to an audience that is composed largely of teams from 6 cities, what should they do about this?
I would say before you get to the capital, the banks, the CDFIs, the impact investors, the fintech, the list goes on, start with the demand side. Particularly given this flow of federal money, which has already started, which is going to come. They will pass a bill ultimately. Focus on the demand side. Go sit with what are mostly public entities. General purpose local government for sure, but then just go through the list of authorities.
County hospital.
All of it,
Community college, 4-year institution, water system, power system.
They're the anchors. They're making the large purchases, and once you actually look at where they purchase, a lot of it will be group pooled. They're looking for lowest price, so they're literally excluding large numbers of next generation entrepreneurs from even entering the system.
I've had the frustration over the years as mayor and also as chairman of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce in San Antonio and the Chamber of Commerce, that those are hard things to do, what you just described. It's a lot easier to meet with a few banks and get some concession that they're going to visit with people or they're going to have people see them. But it's just so difficult to scale it. And it just doesn't work as an ongoing proposition. So again, we use words like access to capital, but then nothing changes on the ground. So your prescription would be, it needs to be systemic and deal not just with the access from the providers, but with the market, the demand side, et cetera.
Absolutely.
So a lot of different pieces here. It's a harder thing to do, but it's probably goes right to the heart of the matter. Mark?
I do want to magnify, however, the work that's being done on the ground. So there is research happening that's being executed yearly by the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, by the Aspen Latinos for Society program. There's coalition building happening. So we need to magnify that work. There is work on the demand side too. There is awareness of procurement officers in the utility space, in the government space, and corporate space. So the work is happening. So we have to do a better job.
The work is happening.
The work is happening.
By whom? By
By
local chambers?
By these groups here.
Okay.
It's not only the local chambers, but there's more integration to like the National Minority Supplier Development Council.
Okay.
So we need to lift up the work and make sure that it's a mainstream topic of awareness, because now we are closing those gaps of research and also on the demand side. So thank you for bringing that up because it's critical. We just need to put it out there more.
Okay. Let's go to some best practices. Tell me what you've seen across the country. Mark, we'll start with you. What's the best case you've seen, first, of a community that is working on all the pieces and it's actually moving capital to worthy small businesses?
Well, I see some.
Can you think of a place?
Yeah, it's right here, because there's diverse owners of capital, venture capital, right here in this room that are actually doing something about deploying venture funding into minority communities, specifically Latino communities.
Tell me a place that's doing it well.
Well, Mr. Beto Payares is here in the
Okay, where? What city?
El Paso.
Okay. Tell me what you've seen.
What I've seen is, first of all, there was an articulation of the demand, that there is technology happening in the great city of El Paso, that it is regional, that there's integration with utilities and academia. So we have put the spotlight on El Paso, and that's happening in clusters. So thank you for identifying these 6 clusters. I think we just need to make this a national footprint.
Okay. Bruce, places you've seen.
So I would go to Cleveland, where for quite some time the Cleveland...
By the way, if you have questions, please, there's some 3x5 cards that are being collected for when we get to the questions in about 10 minutes.
So I would go to Cleveland. Cleveland Clinic, Case Western, Gun Foundation, Cleveland Foundation, obviously, municipal government and others, but it's the anchor institutions that have changed the way they purchase. The best example of this is actually unusual because it's a cooperative entity, Evergreen Cooperatives, which basically does the laundry for the major hospitals in Cleveland. So that's obviously doesn't need to be outsourced to firms all over the United States. It's all going to be done right there. But this is a cooperative owned, in that case, by African American workers, which supplies the hospital. Philly has basically copied that model. We have something called the Philly Anchors for Growth and Equity, the PAGE model. Our universities, our hospitals, our major corporations like Comcast, basically going through their demand, going through their purchasing, and then beginning to organize it into buckets, so it's all similar, and then finding inventory of firms that just don't deal with Drexel or Penn or Children's Hospital or Comcast, but you have and this could be done technologically, I don't know why it hasn't till now, but you could organize the inventory of existing firms so that there's almost a pooled effect in your city.
And tell me about the capital side of that.
So the PAGE effort in Philadelphia has something called PAGE Prep, which works with firms to then understand the capital they need, because the real estate side of the equation is going to look a bit different than if you're selling certain kinds of goods to the, or providing the laundry, et cetera. So to some extent, it's becoming a bit more sophisticated, and then providing that last mile connection.
Okay. Mark, you had a thought.
There's some work done here at the Aspen,
Here meaning?
Aspen Latinos for Society program in terms of establishing a capital savannah, specifically for the Latinx community that looked at personas. So we looked at gazelles and rabbits and unicorns. So I think that's important that we bring it within the community to try to understand our own community and understand that it's not monolithic and that it has some structure.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes before we get to the questions from the floor. So let me just do a kind of a lightning round here. I'm going to mention a word, and I'd like to get your immediate response in one sentence.
Got it.
Of this in a capital context. Okay? So, CDCs, Community Development Corporations, your take on their role in the capital process. Any thoughts?
Required.
Necessary. Bruce?
1970s.
1970s. All right, CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, some of which are in this room.
Required.
Required.
Too much housing focused.
Too much.
Housing, not enough small business focused.
Okay. SBA programs.
Required.
Bruce.
I think SBA is become like the FEMA for small business. Scales during disasters and during normal periods is put on the periphery. It has to be at the center.
Is there any SBA program that jumps out at you as, yeah, that works, the 504 program or any other that you can say?
I love the SBIC kind of on the, that side of the equation. I think that side of the equation is really.
Mark?
Well, I'm a bit biased, but there's several programs.
That's okay. That's okay. That's
so
noted.
The 504, the work in the SBICs, also just potential direct lending options that we're looking into.
Okay.
So there's a suite of products available.
Banks.
Coalition building. Coalition building.
What does that mean? Coalition
What that means
building?
is that we've got to work together. We've got to understand that this market specifically, where we are, especially the non-employer firms, the smallest of the small, that we need to have a capital compass.
Okay.
So it's going to take all of us
Bruce,
together.
banks and minority lending.
More compartmentalized than government. So no focus on the mixing of financing. If you're going to do a commercial card or as opposed to an individual entrepreneur, individual business, check in the box on CRA.
Have you seen specialized funds that can be deployed, capital can be deployed into minority communities? Have you seen anything like that? Specialized funds? Bruce?
I think they're starting. I have to say, I think George Floyd, particularly with regard to, and this tends to get a little segmented, focus on black-owned business.
Yeah.
There is clearly enormous commitments coming out of large financial
Corporations?
Corporations
Financial
and the large
institutions?
banks.
Right.
But is there a theory? Is there a thesis? No. I think it's just a blunderbuss of capital.
Okay. But a useful mechanism at the community
level? If it can be, and working closely with the administration, if it could be put towards this fuller ecosystem effect.
Okay.
The demand side, the support side, and ultimately you get to the problem.
Mark, specialized funds, any comment?
Latitude Ventures, just have occurred in San Diego with the deployment of the Latino GDP report.
Okay.
So Saul Trujillo, shout out to that group, and Latitude Ventures, actually diverse ownership deploying capital to Latinx, tech founders.
You think that's a viable model?
Absolutely.
Okay. Real estate. The real estate issues in minority communities, that poses an opportunity. Is that a starting point? Where do you see that? What's your reaction? Real estate.
I think real estate is just an enormous opportunity.
Yes.
We're going to go through this construction phase at every sector of our society. But the question is, in any given city or metro, who is bringing in the real estate company? First of all, how many
Who's
real estate
bringing in the
firms?
money and will own the property in our neighborhoods?
Yeah. Buffalo's doing some great work with owners of small properties along commercial corridors, backed by state money, backed by M&T. The local banks, by the way, tend to be much more responsive. The bigger banks are too big to fail, too big to function.
Real estate.
Artery. It's definitely all connected.
Okay. Technology. 10% of computer science degrees in America go to African Americans, but only 2% are employed in the technology sector.
Right.
And the numbers for Latinos I have not seen that I can make a comparison, but undoubtedly it's small. I know in my own city, there's a exciting tech block dynamic, but there's no Latino component, and certainly none that comes into the Latino West Side, into the marginalized neighborhoods. Technology as a place to invest in minority business. Bruce.
I would say it's ubiquitous today. I mean, technology permeates every sector, every company. That's what we've learned through the pandemic. I think.
But are there minorities who can be techno businesses?
Absolutely. But again, it's this kind of, I wouldn't even call it technical assistance. It's a different kind of entrepreneurial education. Some of it provided online today, and then some provided in this very customized way given the sector.
Technology as a place to invest. Latino technology as a place to invest. Mark.
Absolutely. And there's wonderful Latino and Latina entrepreneurs in the tech space.
Okay. Say more.
Yeah, so the best I can do is by example.
Okay.
We have Ryan Bethencourt, Latino, who is a vegan dog food manufacturer, leader in the plant dairy movement.
Okay.
Who
Where?
secured, he's in Berkeley and Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay.
And he received Mark Cuban funding, so he knows how to raise money. But technology in terms of the innovation of pet food, it's called Wild Earth.
For a group that's working in these 6 cities, you see that as a potential target area, a potential strategy? Investing in
Absolutely.
Latino tech?
We have incredible millennial Latina and Latino tech founders that should be highlighted and invested in.
There should be more coming.
Period, yes.
Okay, another phrase, entrepreneurial training. Training entrepreneurs. Have you seen any particularly good models where somebody has said, we're going to take 20 people and just immerse them in what they need to grow their businesses? Entrepreneurial training.
I would say the best, Enterprise Center, West Philadelphia, one-on-one. No one would ever go to a doctor and sit in a room with 20 people. You know, I mean, because you're not going to say, oh, by the way, here's my real problem in front of anyone else, right? Entrepreneurial training, that's what we do. We put everyone in a room together and say, hey, maybe you'll learn something. It has to be customized, and we have to basically support it.
Okay, Mark, entrepreneurial training.
Absolutely. The Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative Education Scaling Program and other efforts that are here in this room. And that was called the elevation of mindset. So bringing people together, talking a universal language of business, and it's working extremely well.
And the final one of these words that I'll ask you to comment on is a general one, but I think it's really important to this discussion, and that is wealth building. As opposed to incomes, where Latinos earn 70% or so of what the average American worker earns or family earns, with respect to wealth or net worth, we have 10% of what the white population has. One of the virtues of this strategy of small business development is that we do create wealth opportunities for people, net worth opportunities for people, ownership, right? Which is huge. Your thoughts? As a strategy for the country, as a strategy for the Latino community, wealth building.
It really should be the centerpiece in many respects of Buildback Better. And that means home ownership at scale, but done without parasitic and predatory capital. That's a whole nother conversation. But also from the business side, what it ultimately means, and it really doesn't have to be differentiated across the tech sector and other sectors. It has to be about scale and about growth and about quality growth. And it gets back to this demand side. I mean, you can build a very good business and build wealth in many different sectors of the economy, but you need those ultimately large contracts built over time.
Let me go to the first of these questions, and this builds on something we talked about a moment ago when we talked about Entrepreneurial Training. It says, how are we bolstering access to technical assistance to make access to capital more effective for unprepared small businesses? We have SCORE, which is a volunteer-based SBDC, and that's great, and WBC is awesome. Will there be more organizational support nationally for those kinds of, I think, Bruce, this goes to what you were saying a moment ago, one-on-one interventions. Mark, you want to start? You're in the
Absolutely.
You're doing this from a national level.
I'm on the edge of my seat because the Office of Entrepreneurial Development is launching the Community Navigator pilot that was enacted through the American Rescue Plan. And that is the premise of the Community Navigator pilot, is to create hyper-local approaches that are tied together by national best practices, and access to educational resources is going to be the cornerstone of that program, and it will be launching in December, just about a month away.
Okay, Bruce?
I think whatever SBA is doing, and what SBA should be doing is modeling it, and then the country, philanthropic, corporate, financial institutions should be scaling it 1,000x, 2,000x, 5,000x. SBA has to be the pincer movement, the pioneer, but this should be locally funded. Get a grip, America. We're not going to grow black and brown business unless it's locally funded.
Okay. Foundations are doing more impact investing. Do you believe that they are a potential focus of capital for these kinds of initiatives that we're talking about here? Foundations.
Absolutely.
Do you see signs of interest of signing on to the agenda?
I think there is a small group of foundations led by Kaufman and others. It's like an entrepreneurial network now. Most foundations are not in this space.
Should they be?
Oh, absolutely. And they should be it both with the kind of grant side, but also the endowment side.
And what case would you make to them to bring them in?
That building wealth and inclusive growth, irrespective of where you are.
Small business development in minority communities is an element of...
central element of inclusive growth.
Of an inclusive growth strategy.
Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, I have good news. There's people in the room that are investing in this community at the foundational level. So we just need to be more aware of who they are and announce them prominently.
Well, let's do it. Name some names.
Please raise your hands. But we have Wells Fargo Foundation here, who's invested in...
What foundation?
Wells Fargo Foundation. Wells Fargo Foundation.
Wells Fargo Foundation. Somebody mentioned Kaufman. You mentioned Kaufman. I know they're here.
There's several in the room, yes.
Who else is here from the foundation sector, or...
We have a hand raised.
Who is that? Arizona Community
In Phoenix,
Foundation.
I believe, right?
Okay. Any others you know of, Bruce, offhand, in other cities?
I think the pandemic actually has pushed, particularly the community foundations, into this space. Because before the pandemic, where we really showed the disparities across black and brown, I don't think a lot of community foundations were in this space. Now they've come in because it's a vacuum of major proportions. So I think that's going to be something to watch.
This is an interesting question.
Yeah. Certain foundation as well.
Low-income Latino communities are often targeted by predatory lenders with sky-high interest rates. Undocumented entrepreneurs often turn to these lenders due to the lack of access to capital due to their immigration status. How can CDFI funders step up bringing capital access to the undocumented community? Now, that's not an insignificant group of people in our communities, and it's not an insignificant sector of the economy in our neighborhoods. It's people who are doing food production, who are doing all kinds of home services, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think is the right relationship between CDFIs and the undocumented?
Well, I think the first thing is that CDFI are still immature nationally. There's a couple places, Philly, LA, Chicago, where we see, maturity, coverage at scale. Most parts of the country really don't have strong CDFIs. So I think what we need is a different model, different system of a wholesale CDFI.
But I think it's an interesting question. I mean, it's an important question. A substantial percentage, I don't know how you'd identify it. Maybe Alejandro is something we should look at Aspen, but what percentage of what we want to impact, what we want to grow, is actually undocumented. And are we cutting them completely out of the solutions because of their immigration status?
Mr. Secretary, I would just like to applaud the work of the CDFIs, some of them in this room, that are doing the work and that are creating access points, and I know this community is very, very important to them.
Okay.
No, I mean, and by the way, Henry, I don't mean to be criticizing CDFIs. If we're going to have a national response, we're going to have to sort of just accept the fact that a large portion of the country, geographies, don't have CDFIs or don't have CDFIs of scale. So we can act like we're covering the country. We're not. So I think this is the kind of, what's the structure for a country this size? Mm-hmm. It's too large, actually.
This next question is also one of those that reflects insight because it talks about the real world. In Silicon Valley, it is almost a mark of honor to have failed.
Oh.
And then you get to start again, and you do it again, and you do it again. But you haven't been to war unless you have failed, right? You haven't earned your chops. But in minority communities, if you failed, the game is over. Financial institutions and others regard you as a failure. What do you think we should do about businesses that try, don't quite make it in the first run? Maybe the entrepreneur is very young, maybe they were inexperienced, but we don't want to write them off for life. How do we deal with people who have failed?
We have to embrace them. We have Martha Montoya here in the tech agricultural space in the room. So I think part of this too is understanding and knowing the terrain of what's out there. We've talked about several examples in this room. So I know Martha has had a series of failures, but she has gotten right back up and she's promoted herself and we've promoted her. And I think that's helped.
I think it's the individual versus the collective. Because if you have an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is basically supporting, bolstering each and every entrepreneur, the entrepreneurial failure is in some respects a failure of the collective, not that person. So we've got to build these strong foundations for this. And then I think we can understand, well, why did they fail? Because second time, third time is when they're going to hit it.
Interesting. A couple of other just concepts to throw out there and get your response to. New market tax credits as a capital relationship. Bruce?
Blow it up. It is a lawyer's full-time employment act. I mean, the leakage from the new market tax credit is outrageous, and it needs to be radically reformed. And this is what practitioners say to me, and they go, don't quote me. We don't want to be on the wrong side of the stick. But this doesn't work in a way that's efficient and effective and equitable.
Mark?
I just think that it is all connected. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Leave it at that.
But you can't leave it at that.
Yeah. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I get it. You have a position in the government.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
That would have been my response when I had the old job.
Okay, opportunity zones.
Yep.
Tell me about opportunity zones in Latino communities and their potential.
We have to make sure that we're involving the Latino Latinx entrepreneur in the procurement and making sure that there's opportunities for the Latino entrepreneurs themselves and the Latino entrepreneurs in the opportunity zones. So being at the table, actually leading the table in those spaces is going to be instrumental.
Yeah, the book I bought today is a book called Only the Rich Can Play by David Wessel. If this is going to work for disadvantaged communities, which
opportunity zones,
which I think it can, we're going to have to balance the field, right, between vulture capital and all the accountants and law firms that are advising them, and who's advising the kind of quality interventions we want. The field is completely unbalanced right now. Those who want vulture capital, go into downtown Miami, get 25% returns, they have the ability to do it all, and they go to the right conferences to get the right advice. You want to put just a grocery store in a disadvantaged neighborhood, good luck to figure out that capital stack. So I think we need to understand the playing field on opportunity zones. So I don't think we really quite understood this at the beginning. It's so unbalanced.
Yeah. So I want to close out this session by just returning to the theme. It's not capital per se, but the importance of small business, minority small business strategies in the national picture of where we want to go with equity, where we want to go with inclusion, and creating a stronger economy. In my time as mayor, I used to marvel at how if a firm came to town and announced 500 jobs, it would be on the front page of the paper. But we were creating 500 jobs in small business all the time, every month, and had no small business strategy that was workable. I don't know of a city in America today that has what I would call a small business strategy on the same level as its other economic development programs. They're just, for whatever reason, we just don't get it. We need that fix of those big job numbers as opposed to the incremental cumulative effect of growing small businesses. And yet, small businesses are so powerful in what they do. They have to be part of the strategy. Not only do they create jobs, and not only do they create ownership and net worth, as we described earlier, but they have also the potential for intergenerational transfer. People can leave it for their children and their families and grow it X number of times beyond the present generation. Many people who start in small business become community leaders because they've gained respect for their successes and they gain confidence in their own abilities. And we see focused community development on the ground in the places where minority businesses succeed. So it has massive implications for our communities and massive implications for our country. Your thoughts closing this panel. We'll start with Mark.
We need to build coalitions, and we need to be at the table, and it's about investing in the household and, like you're saying, succession. But procurement, economic zones, and wealth building, intergenerational wealth building is at the central core of success.
Okay.
I think we need a radical, what used to be called a paradigm shift, because the political class, business community will all say the same thing. Small business is the backbone of the American economy. Well, if that's so, we are not supporting it. We don't have the ecosystems locally to provide that demand, to provide that quality coaching, to stay with firms, because it is really hard as you begin to scale to stay with it, and then to have finally that access. I think a lot of times we're just focusing on the wrong end of the telescope, that capital product, when we have to build towards that product. That's where success will lie. Build a whole system.
So there's a real potential in what Aspen has put together here, that we can have 6 examples of how we do it in those cities and therefore replicable in the country.
Absolutely.
What would you say, in closing, is the central part of advice that you would give to the 6 cities on getting to success with this model so that we have something we can take to the rest of the country?
Respect your nuances that make you distinct, but absolutely share amongst each other because you're going to grow and scale that way. So the clusters working together, but understanding their cultural nuances between the cities themselves.
Chicago, Miami, Phoenix, San Bernardino, El Paso, San Antonio.
That's right.
Yes.
Fund Dominica, number 1. No. But secondly, don't put this at the periphery. Go to those large anchor institutions. Go where the money is, and basically use data to understand: are you really with us? Right? Are you really doing the right thing, or is it just at the periphery of your business? Hold them accountable, because that's how we're going to begin to grow and scale.
Let's hear it from Mark and Bruce, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Mr. What? That was a fantastic conversation. Thank you. Let's give it one more round of applause, please. It's a fantastic conversation.